Thank you all again for sticking around. I know we're the last panel of the day and we're competing with the World Cup, so I appreciate being in the company of true IP transition nerds. My name is Chris Laughlin. I'm a Deputy Division Chief in the Competition Policy Division of the FCC's Wireline Competition Bureau. You have heard a lot about the technology-related issues of IP interconnection. You've heard about the public safety-related issues of the IP transition. And this panel is going to focus on issues that impacts from the transition that affect consumers, the tools that support consumers and protect consumers. And we have a lot to cover. So we're going to pretty much dive right into the questions. I'm going to pass it over to my co-moderator to introduce himself and get us started.
Yeah. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Michael Scott, and I'm with the Disability Rights Office. And we are going to jump right in here, and I'm going to give our panelists an opportunity to introduce themselves and then provide a brief answer to our very first question, which we're going to ask about what are the most significant consumer-facing opportunities and risks in the IP transition, and what is the likelihood and potential for impact on each of those opportunities or risks? I'm going to start with Jim.
Okay, thanks. Thanks again for having me as a panelist. I really appreciate it. My name is Jim Tyrell. I'm with Transaction Network Services. For you that don't know who Transaction Network Services is, we provide telecommunication infrastructure, cloud-based call analytics, and numbering intelligence to mobile operators, enterprises, and consumers. Regarding your question, call authentication mechanisms are in place today, aren't reliant on IP networks. There are branded calling ecosystems that are in place today that work with TDM. Spoof protection today does work with TDM because we integrate directly with the enterprise or their calling platform. So I don't think there's that big of a risk. I think there's more upside than anything, especially with the data that we've seen on spoof protection. Early on with some of our larger financial customers, we were able to see who was signing the call, what level of attestation they were signing the call at, and it was really easy to then shut that traffic down fairly quickly. More recently, probably within the last 6 months, we see that there's TDM man in the middle. We've touched on that a little bit in the earlier panels. And so it makes it much more difficult for us to find out who it is. We either have to go to the traceback group or work with the carriers to figure out where that traffic started. Much like what Chairman Carr said earlier, bad actors are using TDM in the middle. And how prevalent is that is based on the data that we've seen. It's around 25% of all the overall traffic. So 25% of the time, 1 in 4 calls don't have anything with stir shake. And so while Chris will introduce himself, but I'm sure everybody knows who Chris is. He's the author of Stir Shake, and Stir Shake is only as good as, I would say, KYC and KYP, as well as making sure that it's all IP. So the more ubiquitous deployment of Stir Shake, and the stronger the framework stronger frameworks becomes more effective in combating illegal spoofing, because bad actors won't be able to intentionally hide behind the TDM in the middle. So again, I think we'll get into this, and I know Rebekah will probably touch on it in a little bit, is around stir shaking and IP connections. Don't solve the problem, or can't overcome the problem of poor KYC or poor KYUP, know your upstream provider. I think those are some of the risks and challenges with consumer protection. Again, I think we've got solutions that cover that. More to come.
Hi, I'm Chris Wendt, and I very much appreciate the opportunity to talk on this panel on this very important topic. I am the VP of System Engineering at Somos. We are the number administrator for the North American Numbering Plan. We're the toll-free administrator. We also run the reassigned number database as well as part of our work with the FCC. We also spend a lot of time thinking about the robocall problem, the fraud problem, and have a number of products that are trying to help the industry combat that problem. Personally, I play a number of roles. Jim already mentioned I'm one of the co-authors of the core specifications for Stir Shaken, but I play industry co-chair role on probably more committees than I'd like to admit to. But IPN&I and on the STIGA technical committee, so I'm fully immersed in the whole Stir Shaken ecosystem for sure, which I love and I'm passionate about, so I'm not complaining. In terms of the question, I think it's such a great opportunity that we are talking about this. I know it's a finally, but the opportunity is really ahead of us. I think we're going to address call authentication on this panel, but I think we're actually solving two problems with one solution, bringing call authentication and all IP together in an organized way using certificates as the trust layer is such a great opportunity, and it validates a lot of the things that we've done up to this point. I want to start there. One thing we talk about a lot as well from a consumer perspective is the telephone number and how people identify themselves on the telephone network and how we need to trust those telephone numbers and making sure that those associations are clear and cryptographic and associated at the certificate level. And one other thing, I'm glad to see David here. We were co-chairs on the Nancy IBC. So talking about video relay, I was also on the DAC when real-time text was initiated. And those are all very important topics that I'm excited to talk more about, that an all IP network can really start to enable more holistically as a primary player in the telephone network and not just a bolt-on. So thank you.
Thank you for inviting me to join this panel. I'm very happy to be here in this group today. My name is David Bahar. I'm Director of Telecommunications Access of Maryland. We provide relay services through TTY captioned telephones, remote conferencing captions. We also provide telecommunications equipment and services for people who cannot use the regular phone. For this IP transition, my frame is coming more from an accessibility lens. As far as analog telecommunications, people have faced a lot of barriers in the telephone ecosystem. We've fought for decades to get beyond that, and this IP transition provides a nice, clean slate to have accessibility up front as first-class citizens. We do want to emphasize that we're talking about today numbering issues, which Chris referred to. Numbering issues and the focus on that allow for an opportunity to really enhance how people with disabilities are able to communicate.
Rebekah Johnson, founder CEO of Numeracle. And first, I just really want to thank the Commission for the opportunity to highlight the consumer benefit and the consumer harm. So we gathered here to address what is the all IP transition. The how has been discussed a lot. It sounds like there's a lot of different ways to address the IP transition. The when, I think, will be the Commission's question to answer. But once we get to why, that's the consumers. That are the American businesses and American consumers who are impacted by what is occurring today on communications network, which is fraud. And fraud is rampant. But when we look at what does the IP transition do for fraud, the short answer is that it creates a transport layer that allows for end-to-end delivery of trusted, verified, and cryptographically signed information about the identity of who's calling down to the consumer. So I think you're going to find that this panel is very much aligned. I think we're more of the optimistic panel that you will hear today. And that's because we're excited about the potential of more than just improving our networks, more than just creating a better transport layer. We haven't even scratched the surface on what the potential is of what more information we could deliver, how we can enhance and improve other solutions, just like the ones that David will be talking about. So there's a lot of positive to it. But I do want to cover some of the risks that are related to it. And when I think about risk, it's about the possibility of something happening, something negative happening. But if we're really going to talk about the risk related to a non-all IP transition, that means we're living it now. This is not a potential, it's actually current state for American businesses and for American consumers. So I want to call your attention to a report that the FTC put out in April of this year. So the FTC reported on the types of fraud by communication channel. The total fraud reported to the FTC, now this is reported by American citizens to the FTC, and we all know that not everybody reports to the FTC. So the total fraud was $5.5 billion. Now that might sound like a big number. And we did hear a lot of panels talk about cost. I think maybe the largest number I heard was 200,000. My number is 5.5 billion. So that is the cost to American citizens. The number is much larger when we think about the cost to businesses who are defrauded by bad actors dialing into the banks or financial institutions. So of that 5.5, 1.1 billion was on the voice network. That's pretty significant. So that says that we're already experiencing the harm. And the conversations that we're having over today and tomorrow really should be focused on how we move forward. I would like to see us move beyond talking about why it's so hard. Let's start to talk about how we can move forward and truly address this gap in our network so that we can get to full trust in the voice communication channel.
Good afternoon. My name is Josh Ruby. I'm the general counsel at Granite Telecommunications. Granite Telecommunications grew up as a competitive local exchange carrier offering what was then solely TDM services, unbundled network elements under the 96 Act, that sort of thing. We've since expanded into a much wider range of all manner of voice and data products and services, including a variety of IP products. I echo the comments from my co-panelists here that we're excited about this and we're glad to be here. But coming at it from that lens, Granite grew up as a competitive provider. So the way that we view this is the important thing is to preserve competition, to make sure that the enterprises are able to offer more and better offerings at lower prices to the consumer. That is one of the ways that we ensure that consumer protection is broad and deep throughout the marketplace. So that's the lens through which we view every aspect of this transition. So what are the opportunities here specific to consumer protection? It's what everybody's been talking about. It's the opportunity to eliminate the TDM in the middle that is the problem in terms of full stir-shaken implementation. What are the risks, though? The risks are doing that in such a way that competition ends up getting limited instead of providing businesses with the providers with the opportunity to address the problem in flexible ways that still get to the results that we need to implement certain requirements that stifle competition, that raise costs. So that's the lens through which Granite views this, and happy to start and looking forward to having a good discussion about those topics here on this panel.
All right. Thank you, everyone, for those intro thoughts. I want to dive in a little bit more on the robocalls related issues. And Chris, I'm going to start with you. I'm glad there's some agreement that there's a problem here, and there's agreement that there's some excitement about moving forward. I guess I just want to understand a little bit more about how big of a problem this is. What exactly is happening? I know we have a sophisticated audience here, but maybe you can talk a little bit more about what's happening that is undermining stir-shaken or tracebacks or other tools, and how big of a problem it is.
It's obviously still a problem, some of the statistics that we mentioned, but I think the core of it is, and to bring it back to some of the former panels, it really is, and I think Josh actually just mentioned it, that IP is all around us. It's just there's TDM in the middle, and that's breaking a lot of the end-to-end security that we need. When you talk about signing something and protecting the transport of calls, you want end-to-end connectivity, end-to-end security, and anything that breaks that in the middle, and anything that we can simplify that to have direct interconnects and other things is an opportunity for us to clean up a lot of the security that makes our jobs hard to truly implement what the core of the standards. Stir-shaken, as I think most people that have read about stir-shaken, was designed for an all IP network, and we were hoping that was one of the incentives to move to an all IP network. I think hopefully we're finally getting there, and we can rely and use the way certificates are used on the internet the same way. We can use them in the same way that we use them on the internet for the telephone network. Use the same tools, bring all of those together. There's sort of a beauty about making this a one network problem where we use all the same digital network tools that we built to secure the internet on the telephone network as well. And they can all work together to create a more secure environment. So I think that's the opportunity. But that is the disconnect of essentially why we're still struggling to get to what Stir Shaken was intended to do in the first place. Go ahead, Rebekah.
And I'll give maybe just a little history lesson. Chris, you can tell us how long Stir Shaken's been discussed. I think maybe I was in high school. I don't know. It's been a while. But where it was really solidified and got mainstream attention was with the Trace Act in 2019. And in the Trace Act, it's addressing or allowing the FCC to pass orders to have the telecom industry implement Stir Shaken, which to Chris's point requires an IP infrastructure. And so there's been a lot of questions as to the FCC required everyone. All exemptions and exceptions have been eliminated. Everyone's supposed to have implemented Stir Shaken, yet fraud only continues to be used across that channel. And the relationship between fraud, identity, and Stir Shaken is actually very intertwined. And that was the goal and objective of Stir Shaken, was to create that end-to-end layer of allowing an identity to be verified, the carrier to attest to what they know about that entity delivering the call, have that signed, and then deliver through the network and terminate to the end carrier. Now, Chairman Carr touched on it for a second in his introduction, and he mentioned there was a path where that information drops. That's the TDM in the middle. So the information, this beautiful, rich information that the gentleman, Chris, he was one of the authors. This is his brainchild. All that rich information that we establish at the front end that IP is allowed to transfer, as soon as it hits a TDM, it's dropped. Now the call is going to continue. We must deliver the call. But all that information that would allow for companies such as Jim Tyrell's on the analytics side to have more information around who's behind the call, that we could deliver that to the consumer and you would know with certainty who it is on the other end. That's critical. We cannot turn the tides of fraud on the voice channel until that is achieved. So it's far more than just, hey, let's do this IP transition. And I think we've had about 100 different acronyms on all these panels today. It's more than just that. It truly is securing our critical infrastructure in the U.S. so that we can stop being the number one funder for global fraud.
Okay, you want to jump in?
Yeah, I wanted to add a little bit on what are some of the challenges with Stir Shaken. We talked about TDM in the middle, but very similar to the first two panels, there's a big difference between what's happening with the small carriers versus the large carriers. So for the large carriers, I would agree with Henry and Matt that 90% of the calls that we see with the large carriers have A-level attestation. So that's a good thing. However, with the smaller carriers, typically only about 20% of their calls get delivered with signed. And then with that, when in place with the smaller carriers, it's enabled full SIP transport. Stir Shaken is at least effectively shows who the traffic originator is. But some of the other things that we see, and we've put this in our robocall investigation report, and I know the FCC's looked at it as well, is that 15% of calls that have invalid telephone numbers have A-level attestation. And so again, it gets back to, yes, I implemented Stir Shaken, but did I implement it correctly, or am I working towards the spirit of the law or to what the law actually says? And I think those are some of the problems that we see within that. And again, it still doesn't address KYC, KYUP, if you will. I know the FCC is very familiar with the Joe Biden deepfake scam. All that was A-level attested. The FCC received some fraudulent calls as well. That was all A-level attested. Again, it goes back to should they have been A-level attested, or yeah, I didn't know who the customer is. Okay, if you knew who the customer was and you knew they were creating fraudulent calls, then you really didn't know your customer very well.
I guess I want to ask a little bit. I'm trying to get a little bit about maybe the level of urgency, the when of when we should do this, and also what's the significance. So, Jim, the conversation that you were having just there suggests, is that really about the TDM in the middle, or is it about store shaking practices, and how does that play into what the focus of the commission should be on with respect to transition?
So for the inappropriate A-level attestation, that's an issue with, how people are implementing stir shaken. Like I've said before, what we've seen with spoof protection is more TDM in the middle. And so it's much more difficult to figure out, okay, who signed it and what level did they sign it? Did they sign it appropriately? Again, if they got it from a gateway provider, and correct me if I'm wrong, Chris, but I gave it C-level attestation. Okay, that was perfect. You did the right thing. But if you gave it A-level attestation and you picked it up at a gateway, yeah, probably not such a good thing. So I think those are some of the things that I think that, again, along with know your upstream provider and what are they doing with their traffic? Are they signing it properly as they should? Are they doing the right KYC things? And I know Rebekah could probably talk for about an hour or two on KYC.
Go ahead.
Yeah, just to follow up on that point, I think part of the issue and part of the opportunity is that fraud sort of hides in the confusion of, did this go over a TDM link? Did it not? Where did it come from? And the opportunity is, if we do, a lot of the rules that the SEC has been putting out have brought the responsibility closer to the actual originator of the call. That's a great thing. If we can use the ability to do interconnection more directly from that responsible provider, then that's also going to help protect the directness of both the authentication of the telephone number as well as the authentication of the provider and the traffic that's coming from them. I think the urgency is absolutely urgent because it's been urgent for a while. But I think the answer to a lot of the confusion about where is it coming from, what network did it traverse over, did headers get stripped by TDM? The original purpose of C and B attestation were not that we wanted those things to exist forever. We were acknowledging the realities of the network that we don't know where traffic comes from. But we were hoping that over time we would solve those things and all traffic would look like what A attestation is supposed to represent, which is that customer has the right to use that telephone number and that you have authenticated them and know that traffic is coming from them. So that is the ideal. And I think the things that we're talking about with all IP only boost the ability to provide a secure network and a secure end-to-end telephone call.
I'm going to address the urgency matter and switch it to necessity. The proposed rulemaking that's out there with regards to caller identity, KYC, KYUP, these are all lofty, beautiful ideas that completely fall on the floor and are meaningless if we don't have the all IP transition. So I think that's really important to understand the relationship that the other initiatives that we know we need in order to address fraud and restore trust in communications is all hinged on the IP transition. So the urgency, to Chris's point, it's always been there. So maybe also think about it from the necessity. It will be the thing that advances us or holds us where we're at.
Josh, I want to see if I can bring you in a little bit. So Chris talked some about how part of the idea behind store shaking is it might incentivize providers to transition to all IP. And Jim talked a little bit about the differences between store shaking implementation for the major carriers versus the smaller carriers. And can you speak to maybe some of the challenges for smaller carriers or how those incentives have played out?
Yeah, so I think the way to think about it is there's a lot of different types of practices out there. I think we come at this as an entity that grew up, again, as a pure TDM reseller, right? And that still operates a number of different types of relationships at a number of different levels of resale. We look at this with respect to, for example, the numbering NPRM. And I know there's been a lot of response to that about the various different types of competitive relationships that are enabled by having multiple levels of resale. And I think that links up with the KYC NPRM that's out there, where one of the things that I think is beneficial there in terms of pushing down the required, I think this is also a part of the numbering NPRM, pushing down the required participation in the robocall mitigation database and the certifications associated with attestations that robocall mitigation plans have been implemented, right? Entries in the database are appropriate, things of that nature. That's an important step in making sure that all of the providers who are associated with originating traffic are attesting that they are actually implementing stir-shaken appropriately. When you're talking about, I actually can't remember if this was Jim or Chris who mentioned the percentage of calls that are originated that have A-level attestations that are not appropriate. It gets much more difficult to assign calls that way if you are attesting under the pains and penalties of perjury that you have implemented the stir-shaken regulations appropriately, et cetera, et cetera. And I think that goes back to the importance of having the way that these problems get solved is by taking the people who are entitled to originate calls on the PSTN and forcing them to say that they're abiding by the rules that exist, rather than forcing people to implement specific rules-based, you must comply in this particular way. The way that the PSTN has worked since its inception is, no, you get a license to operate on the network, and if you don't operate according to the rules that are out there, then your license to operate on the network is taken away.
So you brought up numbering, and maybe we can keep with you and go down that path a little bit. What kind of impact, if any, will the IP transition have on numbering administration as it relates to consumers, and what sort of policies or considerations need to be accounted for to avoid harmful outcomes for consumers?
Yeah, so I think there have been, again, in the numbering NPRM, there are a number of proposals out there. I think our view, again, is that resale limitations are not the way to go, that has, as I think the number of commenters have pointed out, there's a number of different ways in which a whole different series of resale relationships can have pro-competitive effects and can be important for certain use cases, et cetera, et cetera. So I think that's an example of a prescription that is too narrow and does not permit the types of market behavior that we want to incentivize, which is people, voice providers offering more and better offerings. I think there's also some issues with respect to there were some good comments put out by Encompass about this with respect to the effect of termination side analytics as opposed to originating side analytics. So, right, rich call data, the data that's able to be put out by call originators is, and again, we support, and I think having I think this goes back to the rich call data NPRM from back in October. Those are all good suggestions, right? That proving what can be transmitted via, again, from the originating carrier. That's what will scale and ultimately help combat this problem.
Does anyone else have any other thoughts on the numbering related issues?
I had some brief, maybe, thoughts around the numbering traditionally has geographic ties, and we're in an increasingly non-geographic world. People take their phone numbers wherever they go. They don't live in the same place. They're in different places. There's practical impacts to consumers from that perspective. But considering that there's an opportunity here with the all IP transition, which is also, internet is not geographic either, and having geography more as, obviously it's important to 911. There's some other applications where location is and geography is important, but just something else too, like we don't generally talk about that I think we should think more about is what are the consequences of that, and how does that impact the consumer as well? I know there's some structural issues with having the ability to take numbers from one geography to another that we deal with, but just another thought on how numbering might impact from an all IP perspective.
David, I know you had a comment.
I think one important thing to think about when with respect to the numbering issue, especially for people who are using relay services, is that before we had IP or anything having to do with telecommunications, we didn't really have the ability to directly call another individual who used relay. You would have to call 711 first. You would give the phone number that you were trying to reach, and it would get routed that way. When we were finally able to have video relay services that, in fact, could have a phone number, the end user had a phone number that was tied to your endpoint, then it became possible to make those calls directly using that phone number. One of the important parts in terms of functional equivalency is that ability to make those direct calls. Simultaneously, of course, there have been some cons to that approach. So video relay services you might have a phone number for your cell phone, a phone number for your video relay number. You might have 3 or 4 other kinds of relay companies you're doing business with. So you might end up with many phone numbers. So we've got an opportunity here with the IP transition to make it possible for people who use relay services to have just one phone number and to have that operate across all of the different programs and to have it operate directly without going through other numbers. The FCC has put a tremendous amount of effort working into studying this effort. And there are promising pathways. There's Project Iris, where they're investigating how to make those kinds of things possible through the device itself, like the smartphone. There is also the IVC, which Chris and I served on of the Nancy, and how to make that possible using a different pathway, using the governance authority for the numbering issues. So those deserve more attention as we continue to talk about the IP transition.
Thank you, David. That's a great segue. Why don't we turn to some accessibility-related issues and questions? And we'll say the accessibility advocates in our record and the records we've been developing for this topic have really focused on that the IP transition could ultimately improve communications, whether through real-time text, multimedia communications, and improved access to NG911. And perhaps getting back to some of the optimism we talked about earlier on, what are some of those most important accessibility benefits that the OIP environment can provide? And how should we make sure they're being built in from the start, or wherever we are in that process, I should say?
It's a great question. I think, for example, right now with telecommunications, people who do not use their voice or do not hear rely on relay services. And relay service is a wonderful service, but it's not always automatically part of the call flow. So a deaf person has to use a separate app sometimes, a separate service, to enable that phone call to happen. A dream that I would have, that advocates have had for years, is the ability to just, wherever you are, pick up your cell phone, buy an iPhone from Apple, and use whatever is natively in the phone to automatically make a phone call via relay services or whatever kind of service you're using that's built-in accessibility without having to download separate apps or set up special programs. I think one of the frustrating things is that relay services such as VRS or IP relay each company has their own proprietary app, and they are not using the same technology. For example, on smartphones today, I think since 2016, all smartphones have RTT built in. It's on your phone if you check your phone. It's standard video, audio, texting support, all within the RTT platform. So all of those modalities are in, and they can be used by relay services and by individuals. Now with the IVC work group, for example, we were talking a lot and we explored a lot about how to integrate that with the numbering system so that RTT and one phone number are becoming one entity for a person. And you just have one device that you'd be using. You'd have one phone number and you'd communicate however you needed to communicate to everybody else in the world, how everybody else communicates. That was a dream that we had.
Yeah. Please, Chris.
Yeah, I love the examples that David brings up, especially, and actually I'll admit it, the first time I've experienced video relay was having conversations with David many years ago. But it just highlights the issues that having to deal with multiple tools, multiple networks, it's a problem that we can easily solve if we bring everything together for all the other reasons that we talked about to bring TDM and an all IP network together. We have all of the tools, all of the IETF specifications for doing video and real-time text, and all those things should really come together. Real-time text is a success story. We do use the quote-unquote telephone network to transport that, but if we can extend that to provide a wealth of multimedia communications across the telephone network and bring that holistically together under a single telephone number, that I agree, that is the dream that we should be reaching towards for sure.
And I was going to say, it was a pleasure to meet you too, David. And I look forward, we have a follow-up conversation to learn more. Just hearing you talk, I wrote a note to my team saying, I want to solve this. I think there's a lot more potential, as I mentioned, with regards to right now we're just thinking on fraud, delivering identity end to end. But I think David's bringing to the table that there's a lot more innovation that we need to consider. And then you have Chris saying it's possible. So back to the optimistic, we're innovators on this panel. I work with these individuals. And that's what gets us excited about the possibility. And I'll just go back to, I think that's the mindset we need to have in the industry as a whole of let's again not talk about what holds us back, but we have to look forward. And it's pioneers and innovators that look forward. And if you're not looking forward, maybe you're not the right pioneer and innovator to be at the helm. So really take that into consideration. Are you advancing us or holding us back? But I am excited to have David's voice at the table because there's a lot more that can be done. And if I had to say from my professional background, the industry's been absent on addressing it because we haven't really considered and looked at the challenges we need to overcome to make better solutions. So I think now's the time.
If I could just jump in, one thing that David said that I was really struck by was the limitations imposed by proprietary tools on particular hardware. And I think that's something that, I know I said it before, I'll say it again, that it's important for the commission to remember is the frameworks for this transition are being written is that if by endorsing certain proprietary tools or certain specific types of tools, you're prescribing the technology and the offerings will develop in a certain way, when if you used a broader base of standards, the tools would be able to develop along potentially many different lines, which again means that there's more and better tools available, more and better offerings available from the whole competitive landscape that ultimately increases consumer welfare.
Yeah. It's touching on that a little bit in terms of bringing things forward. The other aspect of that is that consumers do utilize a lot of legacy services, or they have a lot of legacy equipment that they do need or they will need, and that all needs to be brought forward into the IP world. And where should the commission kind of focus on ensuring there are solutions to helping consumers transition, ensuring providers are notifying, bringing options available, bringing solutions, ideas forward, and to the extent we need to, what additional frameworks are we looking at in terms of maintaining redundancy, backwards compatibility, so that the transition is as smooth as possible?
I think there's some parallels here with the 911 discussion about making sure that we are pushing the ball forward and setting the path forward to getting to an all IP world. So there is some legacy equipment that will need to be replaced or reprogrammed, or there is a bunch of those things. I think, and maybe David can validate this or not, that we are in a much better place where there is tools out there. It's just a matter of, are those IP-based tools connected to the telephone network as a primary resource or not? So I don't want to put down 911, but maybe we're in a better place here. But so I'm a little bit optimistic there, but maybe David can help validate what I'm saying.
I think that I would agree. I would echo working with other state relay programs when telecommunication carriers switched from copper lines services to the consumer homes to the fiber lines. They did not warn their consumers that this was happening, especially their relay consumers, those who are using caption telephones, those who are using TTYs, and that they were not clear about those devices not working literally overnight. And so that's what happened to consumers out there, is that they went to use their TTY and it just didn't function. And I think they didn't know why. They didn't know what was causing that problem. So the state of Maryland has been spending a good bit of time reaching out to all of our consumers who use legacy equipment precisely for that reason. And what we have discovered is that it can be challenging to reach people, but it isn't always such a challenge that people are imagining. We are capturing a lot of people who use caption telephones through our programming efforts, and we are transitioning them to IP products because we no longer offer analog caption telephone services in the state of Maryland. So my advice is to work within your state programs to reach out to consumers who are working with those analog legacy equipment or software. And analog services are degraded, and they're degrading in front of us. People are having this experience every day where their services, like for example, those who are using TTYs that they've been relying on for years, are no longer reliable. And the benefits of moving quickly, I think, outweighs potential negative ramifications here. I'll say one other thing that has come up, especially with states where they are very rural populations. There are concerns that are raised all the time about moving those folks and cutting them off from the rest of the state. They're relying on analog phones or analog services. That can be a challenge for people who use a subsidized line, but there may be other options out there that, unlike satellite, for example, it's not an equivalent replacement, but it might work.
So I guess related to that, when we talk about moving to those newer technologies, and so how do we ensure that the tech transition and that IP interconnection agreements do not result in inadvertent barriers? That as we move, that we still have access to accessible technologies and services and newer technologies, or newer services, I should say, like direct video calling or real-time text, which we believe will enhance functional equivalency without increasing burdens on consumers who use those services.
The first example that comes to mind is that of calling 711. So people who use TTYs call their relay service, they dial 711 initially, and that gets to a call center. And if they're trying to use 711 with real-time text, what happens, and this is just a simple result of the way the system has worked, it's TDM based, RTT does not work. It requires end-to-end IP connection. So you dial 711 and the relay call will fail. Now, if we got rid of all the TTYs today and encourage people to go ahead and use RTT, they would not be able to do so unless there was an app or something. It's similar to the 911 issue. We encourage people to text to 911 if they can't hear, or if they're in a situation where they shouldn't be using sound. And RTT and text, people are confused about how to do that and how to make that work. If we got rid of what people are currently using, other kinds of accessibility approaches, before people are comfortable with the new approaches or before the new technology is fully mature and ready to be deployed and accepted, we're going to see a failure rate. We're going to see problems come up.
Yeah, I think actually RTT is probably the model to follow. To David's point, maybe we're not 100% there. But I think that's primarily because it is an optional channel and people don't really know about it. And if you bring this more to the forefront, where real-time text, video, other multimedia capabilities are enabled and pushed through, like the process that real-time text took, maybe those things could be more at the forefront, could be part of the telephone network itself, can be used not just for accessible reasons, but for other reasons as well. Hopefully those things will be aspirational to make the telephone network more relevant as well. All the promises that we talked about for multimedia communications in general. And like I said, it's not that those things aren't possible. We do those things daily through proprietary tools. Why not just add those to the, I say just, but I think pushing it through for the purposes of bringing all these things together as a holistic telephone network with all these capabilities really should be the goal of what we want from a truly functional telephone network.
So in the first panel this morning, there was a lot of discussion about timeline for transition and the different frameworks. And some people were targeting the December 2028 timeline that's in the proposal, and others were looking further out, taking our time to make sure the transition works effectively. Jim, can you talk a little bit about what sort of concrete steps that the commission can take in the near term to ensure that the IP transition advances robocall prevention, and when we get to others, preserving accessibility, and then whether there are certain things that we can do right now that are workarounds or alternatives that we can advance the ball on robocall and fraud related issues while we're still working towards the complete IP transition.
Yeah, I think as we get to more IP, all IP, we said that stir shaking is going to become much more effective. The bad actors aren't going to be able to hide anywhere, especially with TDM in the middle. Rebekah brought up 5.5 billion. That's a big number. And it's probably well understated. And knowing that 1 in 4 calls have TDM in the middle, that's not helping. I know the Trace Act, I think Rebekah brought it up earlier, was, it needs to work on the IP network. And I think the commission has looked at opportunities to say, are there other ways to do out-of-band stir shake? And I don't think that's the answer. I think the answer is, can you continue to push forward with the all IP network, stick to those timelines for voice? I know that obviously there's going to be some issues that are involved with, hey, am I going to go with an agreementless paradigm or do I need rural things? So I think going back to the original questions that were brought up by the first panel, keeping inter-carrier compensation and equal access and in USF, those are those to me sounded like those were the biggest issues that needed to get fixed so that everybody could transition to IP.
I'll put in a plug for, as a tool that's at the commission's disposal that I don't think has come up today, is dispute resolution. So we've heard a lot of discussion about various ways in which there can be conflict at the co-location facility and that there can be disputes about how specific interconnection arrangements in the IP world are going to be made. One way to ensure that the IP transition moves faster is to, when those disputes come up, for there to be a fast process that the FCC can adjudicate those disputes. And here's the determination, here's what's the reasonable resolution here that gets everybody the economic result that they need and allows the transition to move forward as to this or that location and replicate it across the problem areas of the network that will move the transition faster.
I think we're doing a lot of the right things. I think the progress towards what we're doing and the rules around call authentication, the goals of making rich call data a part of the network, a native part of the network, which personally I think enforces the need for KYC. If you need to determine a name of a subscriber, you're probably going to need to do more KYC than just trusting the telephone number that comes in. I think a lot of the hooks come together to do exactly what we want to do. But for the all IP transition, that's only going to help things more immensely, because then that, like I implied before, the question marks, the corners that people hide in are no longer going to be there if you have to have an end-to-end authenticated call. So I think we keep doing what we're doing, but all IP is only just going to help increase the velocity of what we're doing, because we can get to where we need to get to, and we don't have to talk about all the noise of all the other problems that we're trying to deal with from having separate networks.
I'm going to comment with regards to the timeline by giving a timeline of how we got here. Maybe that helps. When I think back, the FCC's robocall strike force was 2016. That's been 10 years. That strike force was developed of carriers, made a lot of promises, made a lot of commitments. In fact, I believe the first IP commitment was 12, 15 years ago. That's on record. So there's been a lot of commitments and no action. So unfortunately, in telecom, it does require the FCC to set a deadline. I know I can't get my kids to do anything unless there's a deadline. I get a lot of, I'll do it, and then nothing gets done. I think the deadline has to stay there. Maybe a compromise is that the carriers and those impacted need to come back with some milestones. Milestones with deadlines would be an option to build your way towards the all IP transition. I did hear light touch regulation and let the market solve. I would say fail. We've tried. That doesn't work. So there needs to be a deadline. And I think that's on those who are impacted to provide either a milestone with some goals and objectives, but it has to be in the very, very near future. Then I look at the other rulemaking with regards to the KYC, KYUP, caller identity, numbering. Those are all parallel to the IP. This is not implement all IP and then start to implement the other components. All of those processes can be established today, except for the caller identity one. That really is dependent upon the KYC, the KYUP, that we know with assurance who the entity is, but that information cannot be delivered to the carrier until we get to an all IP network in a reliable manner. So I think the commission does have a bit of a challenge. Number one, you've done such an incredible job to identify the last checkmark items that need to be done, which maybe is overwhelming the industry, but they shouldn't be surprised. They've talked about this. They haven't moved on it. So I wouldn't say change your deadline that you have. I would say the time's been provided. So just got to watch out. The kids might throw all the dirty clothes and toys under the bed. So I think we'll have to set some milestones of what success looks like as well.
So we're coming up on the end of time. I want to give David the last word on this topic. David, are there concrete steps or things that we should be doing in the accessibility realm to move the ball forward for the IP transition?
From my perspective, the two most important things that the FCC can do right now is to prepare for an all IP world. We've been spending a lot of time talking about moving away from analog technologies and phone lines and so forth, but not enough time really preparing for what an IP world is going to look like. For example, numbering. There should be, I would say, more of a priority to move on with either the Iris or IVC platforms, so that one phone number applies to a person regardless of the service they're using, regardless of their accessibility needs. And as well, and this is a big one with the 911 services. We definitely spend time talking about how 911 works, but not enough in the context of relay services. For example, if I need to call 911, the only legally mandated accessibility method that 911 PSAPs have to provide is TTY access. And the FCC has actively talked about moving away from TTY and maybe requiring something else like RTT in its stead. But 911 PSAPs currently, all 5,000 plus of them do not support RTT at this time. And if they don't, what happens to those individuals who need to reach 911 and don't have a way to do so because the TTY is no longer their option? I know it's not an FCC question because I know you don't have the authority over the PSAPs and the 911 technology that they have to implement, but you've done so much work in moving DOJ along the pathway that this should be forefront of mind as well.
Thank you, everyone. I wish we had more time. I know we could talk for a long time about these issues, but it is the end of the day, and I know some people may want to catch the end of the game. So we'll let you all go, and I think I'll pass it back to Jody to take us away.